Good morning and welcome to our Extranet User Manager webinar on Extranets and SharePoint and Office 365. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your presenter today. I'm the president of Envision IT, also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're going to post a copy of this deck up after the webinar. We'll also have a recording of it available by tomorrow from an on-demand point of view. So if you've got colleagues who weren't able to join, by all means encourage them to come out and have a look at the on-demand recording. If you need to get a hold of me, all my contact information is in the deck, which will be up and available on our www.extranetmanager.com site. Also on the call with me, I've got Dinesh Sohan, who's our Director of Products. He really leads the charge in terms of product direction and development for our Extranet User Manager product. And I've got Logan Guest, who is our sales representative. So if you have questions around setting up a free trial, whether that's a hosted version or downloaded and installed in your own environment, interested in pricing details, I'll share some of those through the webinar, but Logan's your go-to guy from that point of view. All right, so let's take a minute and just go over our agenda for the next hour or so. We're going to start with a quick introduction to Extranets. I'm assuming that some of you may know more about them than others, so we'll try and level set a bit from that point of view. We'll talk about SharePoint authentication. How do you come into a SharePoint site, whether that's on-premise or in Office 365 from an external user's point of view. And then we'll talk about our product itself, our Extranet User Manager. What are some of its features and how does it help with some of the pain points from a general Extranet point of view. We'll touch on licensing, and then we'll go to two demos, one on an on-premises SharePoint 2013 and the other from an Office 365 point of view. We do have the question area open. Dinesh and Logan are available to answer questions as we're going through. If we've got a few minutes at the end, we'll circle back and see if there's any unanswered ones from that perspective. So with that, let's dive right into things and start off with just a quick level set on what an extranet is. So an extranet's a website accessible to users outside of the corporate network. So folks who don't work for your company, for your organization, but you want to collaborate with them. You want to share information. You want to allow those organizations, whether they're customers, partners, vendors, we'll talk about a number of different scenarios through there. It is a secure spot, though. It's not wide open and available to the public. There's a number of ways to do that. It could be part of your public-facing website, where we just extend a portion of that and make that secure behind a login. It could be your corporate intranet, where you expose a portion of that externally from an extranet perspective. Or it could be a purpose-built standalone extranet. We'll give some examples of all of those scenarios to give you a sense of what that looks like. So, broader set of potential extranet users, depends on your organization, whether you have members, maybe it's a not-for-profit or charitable organization, customers, vendors, suppliers, volunteers, board of directors is a common scenario, citizens, if you're a government organization, researchers, educational partners, tenants from a landlord point of view, lots and lots of different scenarios. Pretty much any organization works with folks outside of their organization, and how do they do that effectively? So as we're looking to deploy an extranet and we're having a conversation with a client, these are some of the questions that we often ask as we're beginning that conversation. First is just who is coming into the extranet. We threw out a bunch of scenarios there, but let's understand, is it one of those? Is there several different types of groups of users that are going to be coming in? Does everybody see the same information, or do they have private areas either for a group that they belong to or specific to them? Is there some sort of member database that we need to interface with? Do you use Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics CRM from a CRM perspective? How do people come into the extranet? Is it invitation only, where you know who those external users are? Or do you want it to be discoverable, maybe on your public-facing website, where people can self-register, go through an approval process, and then have access to your extranet from there? And what does that approval process look like? And then ultimately, are they just coming into a SharePoint portal, or are there other systems? Quite often we're dealing with single sign-on into multiple different systems for those external users, and understanding what those are, how they authenticate, and what that's going to look like. So from a technology focus point of view, you can build an extranet a lot of different ways. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're very focused on the Microsoft stack. So of course, that's going to be our area of technology focus. So SharePoint being where we started, Office 365 in the more recent versions over the last two plus years or so now, leveraging Microsoft Azure from both an infrastructure and a service and an Azure AD point of view that we'll talk about a little later. And then, of course, our Extranet User Manager product itself, which is our tool for managing those users who are outside your organization. We're going to learn more about that as we dive into things from there. All right, what I'd like to do is take a quick pulse of the group that we have here and get a sense of what your current experience with SharePoint is. Let me just open this up here. So you can answer more than one of these. You may be in both an on-premise and an Office 365 from a hybrid point of view. You may be running different versions of SharePoint, maybe 2010, 2013. Some of you may even already be moving to or on 2016. So we'll leave that open for about a minute total. So it'll give you a chance to answer that. And then what I'll do is I'll share those results back with the group so you can see what that looks like from a peer perspective. All right, about 2/3 voters. Give you about another 10-15 seconds, last few to cast their votes in there. Okay, let me close that out and just share that out with the group. So Office 365 taking the lead. We've been seeing that grow as we've been doing these webinars over the past couple of years. Certainly hasn't been in the majority position for most of that time, but we're starting to see that now. So that's quite interesting and quite keen to see that. So a little over 2/3 on Office 365. Only a couple on SharePoint Server 2016. It's been out for less than a year now, so it's pretty new for a lot of organizations. A little over half on 2013. And a few back on 2010 and a couple on 2007. We'll talk later in terms of what we support. We cover that whole stack except for the MOS 2007. Our product and the authentication model in 2007 are not compatible. It was very different to what they built in 2010 and then carry that forward in 2013 and 2016. All right, so let me just hide that. And there's one more quick poll that I want to do. This is the last one. I just want to get a sense of how you use SharePoint today. Is it strictly being used for internal collaboration? Maybe you've got your staff portal or your intranet up on SharePoint. Maybe you're already using it from an extranet point of view and you're looking to improve on the user experience around that. Or you could have your public-facing website on SharePoint as well. All right, we'll give a few more seconds there for everybody to cast their vote. Okay, let me close that out. And just share that results. So almost everybody using SharePoint from an internal collaboration point of view. Not surprising, that's where a lot of organizations start with team sites and internal collaboration. About half using it from a staff portal or an intranet perspective, also a very common scenario. A little over half from an extranets point of view. So if you're not using our product today and you're attending the webinar, hope you get some tidbits out of this and maybe some ways that you can improve on that. And a few folks using it from a public-facing website. We're going to have a future webinar on the public-facing website perspective, recognizing that Microsoft no longer supports that from an Office 365 point of view. Honestly, they never really did. It was a pretty minimal version. But we were doing some interesting projects with clients right now around using Office 365 and Azure to build both a public-facing website and an extranet without exposing Office 365 directly. So interesting things coming down the pipe from that perspective. So let me hide that. And let's come back to our deck and dive right into the topic of SharePoint authentication. So if we think about our product, it really serves two purposes. And we'll talk more about it a little bit later. One is provisioning those and managing those users who are external to your organization. And the other is signing those people into SharePoint. So we need to talk about how that SharePoint authentication happens. So we're going to start on-premise. We're going to talk about Office 365 in a second and just go through the various different scenarios. First scenario is Windows authentication. This is how most people are familiar with SharePoint. They're working for an organization, they're on a domain-connected computer, they open their browser, and SharePoint just opens up. They don't really see a login page, they don't know what's happening under the hood. That's called Windows authentication. It's going directly against Active Directory and using your credentials that you're already signed into your computer with. So that works well for staff, not so much for external users, because they don't necessarily have AD accounts. In the past, we had built our product on what's called forms-based authentication. What happens here is if I'm an external user, I get a web form that comes up, I fill in a username and password. We used email addresses, their username to keep that simple, and that authenticated and it went into SharePoint from there. It worked, but it was very tied into SharePoint, and there was a lot of customization and configuration needed to do if you're a SharePoint install to get that going. We built an installer to make that easier, but we're not really a fan of a forms-based auth going forward. And then came federation. So this is the idea that you can federate with other organizations and have those users be trusted into your SharePoint site. And what we do with our product is we leverage that and we say, well, our Extranet User Manager product actually becomes what's called a trusted identity provider. So when somebody hits your SharePoint site, says, I don't know who you are, it actually redirects over to our product. We present a login form. They type in their email address and their password. They log in, and that through what's called a SAML claim goes back to SharePoint. SharePoint says, I trust that. I know who you are. I'm now going to let you in and do whatever you're allowed to do from that point of view. So that's actually how we've built our product. If you use Active Directory Federation Services, which is a way to do single sign-on, that also uses federation as well. So very much a similar model to EDFS if you're familiar with that. There's a new model though that's just coming out, and we're not all the way there in terms of supporting it yet. We're still working on it. It's an interesting model though. The idea here is use what's called the Azure Application Proxy, which is basically a cloud-based reverse proxy. So you don't directly expose your SharePoint site out onto the internet. You publish it through Azure, through Microsoft Cloud Services. People come in through that, and they log in, they can then get into your SharePoint site from there. The second step to that is we can use what's called Azure AD B2B. We're going to talk a fair bit more about that through this session. This is a business-to-business service from Microsoft that lets you invite external users into your Azure AD. And through that, and through the Azure Application Proxy, you can bring those people into your on-premises SharePoint. So even though that's a cloud-based service, you can actually use it for authentication into your on-premise SharePoint. If you're doing hybrid, where maybe you've got both Office 365 and on-premise SharePoint, this is nice because you can use that B2B both for your on-premise and for your Office 365. Which is kind of our segue into the next section, talking about what our Office 365 authentication options are. The first one is called Cloud Identity. This is what happens when you first create an Office 365 tenant. It creates accounts for you and whatever users you want to create in Windows Azure Active Directory. So those accounts are up in the cloud. You've got a username and a password that are kept in the Azure Active Directory, and there's no integration to your on-premises identity. So you just have an identity for the cloud that's separate from your on-premise. A lot of clients then say, well, we want to use a single password. We don't want to remember a different password for Office 365. So you can do what's called a password synchronization. So it takes your on-premise username and password that you use to sign on to your computer at work, and it synchronizes that to the cloud, and you use the same username and password to log into Office 365. So it's not single sign-on. You still have to log in a second time to the cloud, but it's a single set of credentials. So it's easier for people that don't have to remember two usernames and passwords. So that's good for your on-premise users. Then there's what's called federation. Just like we talked about in on-premises SharePoint, this is where you have an identity server that federates with Office 365. So when Office 365 says, I need to know who you are, it redirects over to that server, you log in, and away you go from there. I mentioned ADFS previously, Active Directory Federation Services. It's a Microsoft component of Windows Server that lets you do this single sign-on federation with Office 365. So your users log into their computer at work, they launch their Office 365 portal, they're already signed into their computer, ADFS does a single sign-on, and they're into Office 365 with a true single sign-on where they don't have to enter their credentials a second time. We can leverage that just like we do with on-premise SharePoint and say, well, we can put our identity provider in the mix there and authenticate users that way as well. The challenge though is that if we do that, those users aren't truly considered external users from Microsoft's point of view, and you actually have to buy subscriptions for that. So that doesn't work too well for most clients. Charitable organizations that get free Office 365 or educational clients, that's fine. Everybody else, that tends to be a showstopper. So that brings us to our fourth option here, which is also that Azure Active Directory business-to-business service. The idea here is you invite those partners into your Azure AD. They use their own credentials, and I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later. to come into your Office 365. And from Microsoft's point of view, those are considered external users. They don't need a subscription. You don't pay any additional fees. You can invite as many of them as you want. You could have thousands, tens of thousands, millions of those users. That's all within the scope of the Microsoft Online Services Agreement. As long as your staff are paying their subscriptions, you're good to go from that point of view. So that's a great scenario for building an extranet on Office 365. So let's talk a bit more about Azure AD B2B. It's the service that's going to provide that single sign-on experience both in Office 365 and potentially even into your on-premises SharePoint. So it's very simple. Your partners get invited into your Azure AD. If they have an Azure AD account themselves, that's the easiest for them. So let's say they use Office 365 themselves. They don't need a new set of credentials. They use the same credentials that they log into their Office 365 to get into yours as well. So it's nice from that way. If you need to remove them, you just remove the permissions from Azure AD. They no longer have access to your portal. The really nice thing to think about here, though, is one of the challenges in extranets is you often don't know when your external partners no longer work for those organizations. You've invited somebody in from one of your partner organizations. That employee leaves that organization. Do they still have credentials and access to get into your system? If you're using B2B, they're using their core credentials on their side. Odds are when they leave that organization is going to be right on top of shutting down their account within that organization, which actually immediately removes them from your system as well. So it's nice from a security perspective. So we invite them in. We can manage their permissions through Azure AD groups. It's all secure. We talked about partner leaving and where you go from there. Now, this was predicated on them having an Azure AD account already. Now, if they don't, doesn't mean they can't do this. What happens is behind the scenes, Azure AD B2B actually creates a Azure AD tenant for them, and they can set their username and their password, log in through that, and away they go from there, and they can still access your system. So it's a little more steps to go through from that point of view if they're not already in Azure AD, but absolutely possible from that point of view. So from an Azure AD B2B and Office 365 point of view, you can then manage all your permissions in SharePoint Online exactly the same as you do for your on-premise users. They don't need an Office 365 subscription. You can apply permissions to the Azure AD groups and then just manage the membership of those groups from there. And I'll show you later how you can actually delegate that out to your site owners so they can actually manage the membership right through our Extranet User Manager product. So I mentioned the first two scenarios here. I didn't cover the third one. So the first one is I already use Office 365. It's a very seamless experience to accept the invitation and go in from there. Second scenario is I am using a commercial email address, but I don't have Azure AD today. It's actually going to go through the process of creating a tenant, creating a user account for that, and letting me set my password. And there's the ability to reset my password if I forget it later. Longer term down the road, let's say that organization that person belongs to decides to sign up for Office 365, they can actually take ownership of that tenant and convert it into their corporate tenant from there. The third scenario is the person that you're bringing in actually has a consumer email account, like a Gmail or a Hotmail account, Outlook.com, what have you. In that case, that account needs to get converted to a Microsoft account. It may already be, in which case, again, it's very seamless for them to come in, or it walks them through that process as part of signing up to your tenant. So 3 different experiences depending on the types of users that you're bringing into your site. So what are some of the challenges that we see with the current Azure B2B? And bear in mind, it's still in preview. It came out about 1.5 years ago. It went through a major overhaul last fall around the time of Ignite, but it is still considered a preview service, and there are some limitations around that. One of the big ones is just around delegation of user management. A lot of our scenarios, we have clients that want to delegate to the business and allow them to manage who they're bringing into their site. That's a little tough to do because you've got to give them access to all of Azure AD to be able to invite those external users in, and you can't really restrict that to say this group manages these users and this other group manages a different set of users. It is managed through the Azure portal, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. That can be a little overwhelming. If you've gone into the Azure portal, you realize it's a very technical portal. It's not really intended for end business users, so that can be overwhelming for them. If you want to do a self-registration approval process, that's not supported there. You'd need to build that yourself. Likewise, if you want to have some integration to other line of business systems, I mentioned things like CRM, profile management, and so on, so forth from there. The last point is really to do with my on-premises SharePoint scenario at the beginning that I talked about, where we want to use Azure Application Proxy to provide access to that on-premise system. You can do that through Azure B2B, but what you have to do is, as well as inviting them into Azure AD, you also need to create an on-premise account for them. So they still need an on-premise Active Directory account. They don't need to know that it exists. They don't need to know the password for it, but it needs to be there and connected to their Azure AD account. So that's something that you need to wire up for each user that you're inviting in through that process. And what we've done in our Extranet User Manager product is look to address most, if not all, of those scenarios. So I haven't really talked about the product itself. It has two main sides to it. One is the administration console, which is not just for IT administrators to use and configure the product. It's also for delegation out to the end business owners themselves. So they can manage the users that are coming into their site, invite users, approve users, create groups if they have the elevated rights to do that, and so on and so forth from there. The other side to it is the external user portion. So if we're not doing Office 365, if we're doing on-premise and we're managing the login experience, having that login form, having the forgotten password process, because external users often are infrequent, they don't remember their credentials, we need a self-service around that. Any of the self-registration, the approvals around that, and provide a very simplified login experience, both for internal and external users. So that's in a nutshell what the product's about. We're going to get into to more details in a second. So if we are taking the route, though, of using Azure B2B, what does Extranet User Manager layer on top of that? Well, we provide the self-registration, the profile management, that delegation that you can delegate different groups to different site owners from there. Basically, they do all that work in the Extranet User Manager product. We call into Azure AD behind the scenes through various different APIs in order to set that up from there. We manage the invitation process. The login process itself happens through Azure AD. That's the one piece of the user experience that we don't control. But there is branding that you can do to that login process as well that we'll see as well. And we can manage the group membership. You can leverage that from a permissions point of view, from a governance perspective. If we're using Extranet User Manager with SharePoint on-premises, I mentioned before, we act then as the identity provider. So we present the login form, we provide single sign-on, not only to SharePoint, but we'll show you how that works for other on-premise or cloud-based apps as well. Excuse me. And we can provide a fully branded registration and login experience. Okay, so let's run through some of the features in a bit more detail. So branding is very important. All of our clients are looking to maintain a corporate brand through that entire user experience. So everything from login, registration, all the end user pages need to have the brand applied to them. I've got a screenshot here of the Kinross portal. I actually have a version of it up in my browser here, so you can see what that looks like. They've got a very pretty, nice login form here. I can click on the Register Now link, go through a very customized registration process. We'll come back to that in a minute. Single sign-on. So when I sign on to one system, I have automatic login to other systems if there's multiple systems that we're managing. It's all managed under the hood through SAML tokens, through a proper secure way of doing single sign-on. It's a nice experience from that point of view. And again, as we get into the demo, I'll show you what that flow looks like and how that feels. Home realm discovery is a feature of our login process, and what it's intended to do is to streamline the flow for internal users. So basically we go through a decision tree that says, hey, basically looking at the IP address that you're coming from or the email address that you enter into the login form to figure out if you're an internal staff member and take you straight into the portal. Otherwise, take you through the login form as an external user to log in, and away you go from there. So if I'm working for the organization and I'm inside the corporate network, I shouldn't see a login form at all. I just go straight into SharePoint. So it feels like that simple Windows authentication scenario we saw at the beginning. There may be more complexity under the hood, but we're hiding that from the end users. a multi-factor authentication for your external users. So most clients don't use this, but it's there as an option depending how secure your content is that's in your extranet, and how much validation you want to put on the external users that are coming in. Basically what happens is an external user hits the login form, they still have to put their email address and their password in, but then depending on rules, we decide whether we call out to Azure to do a second factor authentication. That can be a interactive voice response phone call or an SMS text message. They respond to that. That comes back in. Once they pass that validation, they're into SharePoint from there. Now we've got intelligence in there as to when we trigger that second factor authentication. So it doesn't have to be every time somebody logs in. We've got rules such as, are they coming in from a new IP address, or are they on a device that we haven't seen before? Did they make a mistake entering their password on a previous attempt? Maybe we should double check this. Maybe they've gone through a forgotten password reset, so we should do a second factor authentication there as well. Basically looking at risk factors to say, what's the likelihood that this is not the person we think it is, and we need to do that second factor authentication. The service is provided by Azure. There is a cost to that. It's basically 15 cents per transaction. So each time it does a text message or a phone call, your subscription gets charged that 15 cents for that. Self-registration is a very important feature for a lot of our clients. Not everybody has it. Some people do invitation-only extranets, but I would say the majority of our clients do use a self-registration form. So the idea that somebody can come to the site as an anonymous user, enter in their information, go through some sort of approval process, and then ultimately get their welcome email and come into the site from there. So this is very customizable. It's actually its own Visual Studio project. We can integrate it into back-end systems, and I'll show you some examples from that. So this is probably a good spot to jump out into a bit more depth on some of those sites. We started on the Kinross site. We saw the login form. I hit the register link. I'm here on the beginning of their registration process. They've actually worked with us. They did a lot of the development themselves with support from us to build a very involved multi-step registration process. So this portal is for the 6,000 supplier companies that provide services to Kinross around the world as a global mining company. And basically the first thing I need to do is identify myself as a supplier. So as I typed in our company name in Vision IT, I can see that we're actually set up in their JD Edwards ERP system, and I can see a portion of the JD Edwards number there. I'm going to need that complete number, so I'm going to need a PO from them or something with that JD Edwards number on it to continue through this process. And then as I come through, I'm going to be setting up what's called an administrator and a signatory as a supplier, because the purpose of this portal, a lot of it is around onboarding of suppliers, going through various checklists around ethical sourcing, corporate social responsibility and such, to make sure that those suppliers are doing business appropriately with Kinross. So they need the appropriate people to be able to sign off on through that. So they go through that approval. Once their account is approved, the administrator at the supplier actually becomes the owner of that group, and they can actually manage the users within their external organization. So this is an example where we're actually delegating not just down to the business within Kinross, but actually out to Kinross's suppliers with the portal. Some of the other examples here, we've got Public Health Ontario, and this public-facing website built on SharePoint. I can click the register link here. Come into their registration. I've got a number of fields to fill out. This is a first level registration where there is no approval. I just enter all my information. I get a welcome email. I can sign onto their site. I can interact with discussion forums as a named user and such, but I can't see any additional content. Deeper in, once I've logged in, I can go through a second registration approval process where maybe I belong to a municipal public health unit, for example, and I'm an epidemiologist that need access to lab data and BI resources, which is behind that second level user security within the site. So that goes through a different approval process. Once I'm approved, I can actually see a whole wealth of BI data underneath this site. Let's have a look at a couple of other ones here. Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. This is a bilingual site. We'll talk about multilingual in a minute. So all the content on their public site is available in both English and French. If I come over to their members portal here, I get their login form. I can actually flip this over. So if I come back to the site as Francais, being a Canadian organization, English and French is important. It's all available from that point of view. I forgot my password or registration links here. I can go through the registration process. In their case, let me actually just flip that back to English. I'm identifying my relationship with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, and I'm also entering in the approver email myself explicitly. The reason for that is this is a members portal. We want it to be very organic and open. If I know somebody who's already a member of the portal, I can put their email address in. If they know me, they vouch for me, they just hit one button to approve me, and now I'm in the portal and I can approve somebody else. So again, a different model of delegation from that point of view. G2G Marketplace is a spot for U.S. municipal and state level governments to come to source IT products that are already pre-approved from a procurement point of view. One of the products they can source through the portal itself is our Extranet User Manager product, but also if they need to register on the site in order to go through that procurement process, you're actually using Extranet User Manager as the front door into the site as well. So it's kind of there in two shapes. One providing the functionality of the portal, and the other as being a product within the portal itself. Supreme Court of Victoria, this is a case management system for commercial cases in the state of Victoria in Australia. Here you've got barristers and solicitors who are coming in to register cases and actually file a case that's going to be heard before the Supreme Court in Melbourne, Australia. So they go through the sign-in or the registration process here. Again, they provide all their information, including their practitioner bar roll number and such, so they need to be a registered barrister or solicitor to register through here. Now, we don't actually do any double checking of that. We just allow them to register, pay their $3,500 Australian, and file their case. Ultimately, they're going to be standing in front of a Supreme Court justice. They better actually be a barrister or solicitor and not just impersonating as they're going through here, or they've got bigger issues going on. Problem gambling is a healthcare example where treatment professionals and researchers can register and sign in to the portal site through here. And then the last one I want to show you is actually on the Office 365 side. So I'm going to open another browser window here in Firefox, and I'm going to go to ocas.sharepoint.com. So OCAS is the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. They are the umbrella association on top of the 50 plus children's aids societies across the province of Ontario. So they provide training and resources to about 8,000 staff at those member associations. They have an Office 365 portal to do the to provide the resources for that. I can go through a registration process through here. This one, if I select a member society and I enter in an email address whose domain matches that society that I'm registering with, it auto approves me because it says, well, you have an email with that organization, you must actually work for them. I'm just going to let you straight in through there. If I say, well, I'm actually coming from other or government Ontario, it's going to go through a manual approval process where it sends an approval email to somebody at OCAS. They review that, say, yeah, that looks good, and then they bring you in from there. Once I sign into the site, I'm actually into Office 365. Let's actually go through that. Looks like I've forgotten my password. We'll leave that one for now. It's actually been a while since I've been on that site. Not only does it bring me into Office 365, we actually do single sign-on into Desire to Learn, which is a cloud-based training learning provider that provides self-paced learning to those 8,000 staff at the member societies. So lots of different examples from that point of view. Forgotten password, that's what I should be using on the OCAS site. We'll touch on that one in a bit. Basically, I click the link, I enter my email address in, it sends me an email. We don't actually send the password in the email, that would be very insecure. What we do send is a one-time use, time expiring token. They click the link in the token, that takes them to a page where they choose their password. So the idea is the only person who ever knows the password is the external user themselves. There's no ability for administrators to see external users' passwords. Lots of people share passwords between sites. We want to make sure those are stored in a one-way encrypted format that people can't discover what those passwords are, even internal administrators of the system. So from a support point of view, I mentioned at the beginning, we don't support 2007. That one's a little bit too old of a vintage, but 2010, 2013, 2016, and Office 365 are all supported by our product. We've talked a fair bit about the delegation already. This idea that you can delegate the management of the external users out to the business, or in some of the examples that we saw, like Kinross, actually to the external organizations themselves. So what we don't want to have is IT being a gatekeeper here. The business wants to manage and own that themselves. We've got to do it in an easy way for them to do that. It's all fully adaptive, so we'll show you as we go through the demo. We use Bootstrap from an adaptive CSS framework point of view. So whether you're on a smartphone, a tablet, a desktop, the experience is going to work well across all those different devices. We can host the product in the cloud for you. We run a multi-tenant service in Azure. We provide management of that, and we have a third-party firm that provides 7/24 monitoring and remediation to make sure that's working well for you. Or you can install it into your own infrastructure, whether that's in your own data center or in your own Azure tenant. Either are supported from that point of view. You can install it onto a SharePoint server itself. We generally recommend that you dedicate a separate IS server just for Extranet User Manager. It decouples it so that if you go through future upgrades of your SharePoint, things like that, it's not tied in with that. It's independent of that. It's better from a support point of view, from an all parties perspective as well. We touched on multilingual. I showed you the Boys and Girls Club, English and French. The Kinross one actually was translated into about half a dozen different languages. So we use resource files under the hood, which makes it easy for you to change, not only from a translation point of view, but if you want to update the English copy even, that's something that you can do yourself on any of the end user pages. So how do we license our product? What's involved in actually purchasing it? We keep it very simple. I've worked in the Microsoft's world for a long time. Theirs can get overly complex. We said, how do we make this as simple as possible? Well, we've got two editions, Standard and Enterprise, and we've got two ways of purchasing it, either a perpetual on-premise license or a hosted subscription model. So difference between Standard and Enterprise is really the number of systems that you're authenticating to. So if you're just running a SharePoint extranet, it doesn't matter how many web front ends you have, how big your farm is, how many web applications or sites you've got on there. That's a standard edition. If you say, well, we want to do single sign-on to multiple systems, like the OCAS scenario where they were going to both Office 365 and Desire to Learn, that's considered an Enterprise edition. So that's really the difference between those two. So either $8,000 or $13,000 US for a perpetual on-premise license, and then there's a 20% annual software assurance. That software assurance gives you rights to upgrade. It also gives you rights to run dev and test versions of the software. So as long as you're current on your SA, you can run as many dev and test farms as you want. You don't need to purchase any additional licenses for that. You just pay for your production server license. If you want us to run the environment for you, same Standard and Enterprise rules apply. It's either $850 or $1070 a month US dollars. That includes the Azure costs for hosting that. You have your own private dedicated SQL database that keeps all your information separate from the other tenants within there. Software assurance is included automatically with that. We can spin up a test version as well as the production version, all under that price. So all the full pricing details are available on our site. We're very public with how the pricing model works. Lots of different clients. I've shown you examples of a number of them as we've been going through. Lots of different sectors, both private, public, not-for-profit, all covered off through there. All right, so let's flip gears and go into a couple of demos. So we're going to start with SharePoint 2013, and then we're going to switch into Office 365. So let me start by firing up a fresh browser window here. So I've got a brand new version of Chrome going. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm actually going to go into our Office 365 site first. The reason I'm going to do that is I just want to explain that we're using Active Directory Federation services for our staff to go into our Office 365. This is the single sign-on idea. We've actually configured it, so even though I'm inside, it pauses and shows me the login form. Normally, you would configure it to go right by this, but from a demo point of view, it's nice to stop here and understand that ADFS is sitting in the middle here. So this is my Active Directory credentials. I hit sign in. It's going through a couple of redirects here, and ultimately I'm going to land back at the Office 365 site. So that's an example of a federated login using single sign-on and ADFS into Office 365. You can do the same thing with SharePoint on-premises as well. We're going to see that in a minute. So let's actually jump into a couple of sites here. So I'm going to start by going to our demo site. So productdemo13.envisionit.com is the URL. You can hit that yourself. It's a publicly available SharePoint 2013 site, and we can see the top level site in it is anonymously available. So I'm not currently signed into the site. So whether I click the sign in link or the access the private area, it's going to trigger an authentication. Now it's also wired in with ADFS, so we saw it flash by the login screen. It went through the ADFS login. Because I'd already logged into Office 365, I'm now into my on-premises SharePoint. So that's a nice example of a hybrid SharePoint on-premise and Office 365. ADFS wires it together. I'm a staff member. I got a nice single sign-on experience to both of those sites. Now I'm going to go into what we call landing admin. Oops, let me actually open that in a new tab here. So this is our administration console for our product. So this is where business owners or even external business owners would come to manage those users that they're responsible for. It's also where IT would come to configure the system. So we've got options here to configure email templates and things like that. We'll touch on those a little bit later. If I was logged in as what's called a group owner, they only have rights to search, add, and import users into the system, and those are the only options that they see here. So it's a very simple interface for those business owners. So let's go through the scenario now that I actually want to invite in an external user. I could do it in a couple of different ways. I could come back to the public area of the site here, and we'll see here we've got a link to register for a new account. And again, this is publicly available. You can hit and see this page. This is our standard out-of-the-box registration project. So this is basically the starting point for any client project that we're going to do. You can add or remove fields from here. It does require development effort in order to do that, but it's fairly straightforward, and we publish a full developer guide on how you would do that if you want to do that work yourself. So if you've got .NET developers that are comfortable doing that, we can provide the source code to this project, and away you go from there. Also, though, we could come directly into landing admin and say, I just want to add a user directly through here. So I'm going to cheat in the interest of time and skip the registration and the approval process and go straight through to adding a user through here. So we need to enter a first and last name, an email address. I can make the username the same email address there. I'm going to set this as an active user. In a minute, we'll talk about the Azure B2B side of things. And I need to decide what groups that I'm going to put them in. I have to put them in identity server users, and I'm going to put them in this EUM SharePoint group. And the reason I'm doing that, if I come back to the private area here, so I'm signed in as a site collection administrator right now. So I can come down into my site settings, and I can see my site permissions. And I can see that this EUM SharePoint group here, which is considered a domain group, has read access to the site. So anybody I put into that group is then going to have access to the site. And this is how we like to do things from a governance point of view, is set it up so that the group that you've got in here already has the right permissions to SharePoint. So when I invite this user in, I don't need to do anything more in SharePoint. They're already a member of that group, and they get whatever permissions that group has assigned to them, and away they go from there. So you don't need to give your site owners the ability to manage permissions in SharePoint. You just need to give them ownership of the group that they're going to be managing. So I go ahead and save that. Whoops, I think I took too long going through there. Hang on a sec. Let me try that again. Okay, so what it's doing now is it's adding that user into our database, but it's also adding them to the underlying identity provider database. And that can be two things. That could be Active Directory, or it can be a SQL database. In our case, we're using SQL, but you may want to use a separate AD within your extranet to manage those external users. Depends on your scenarios and how you're going to be using that. All right, so since I directly invited this user in, we don't need to go through the approval step. They're immediately going to get an approval email. Discovered this morning I'm having a little bit of grief with our emails coming out of our demo site, so I'm just going to pull that over on my other system here and bring up a logged version of that. So this should look a little prettier normally coming in through my Outlook. Right now it's coming up in the browser. So this is the user that I just created, the pcarson2, and I need to set a password before tomorrow at this time. So we've set a 24-hour expiry on this one-time use token here. If I click on that link, I can then set that password. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to actually copy that link, because I'm already logged into the site here, and I'm going to flip over to my incognito Chrome that I have on this side here and paste that link in. So now I'm acting as that external user who's received the welcome email, they've clicked on the link, and they now want to set their password to be able to come into the site. All right, so we've got some rules around password complexity here. Those are under your control to define, how simple or how complex you want your passwords to be. I'll go ahead and choose one. In a more recent version of VUM that we're still working on, it actually gives you a little graphical helper as you're building your password through there. I hit change password, and it's now set my underlying password. So I come back to my home here. I can sign into the site. So let's use that email address that I just created the account for, and the password that I just set. And actually, let me just do open a new tab on the forgotten password for a second. So let's imagine that I'd forgotten my credentials like I did on the OCAS site. I would just enter my email address if I spell it correctly. Request that, and it'll send me an email very similar to the welcome email. It has a different token on it. You can set the expiry on that separately for me to be able to reset my password. Now, I remember my credentials because I just set it, so I'll go ahead and sign in. And I'm now in our landing application, which is our EUM from an end user point of view. So I can do things like have a look at my settings. So if I need to update my profile information, in this particular case, we've locked the email address down. We do support changing the email address. It's just a lot of our clients don't want their external users to be able to modify their email address because that's their primary unique identifier. I can also change my password. So if I remember it, but I want it to be something different, enter my old one, double enter my new one, go ahead and change my password from there. Now let's open another tab here, and let's go to that SharePoint site. Now I want you to watch carefully because we're going to flip through a couple windows here. Actually, it went too fast for us. Oh no, we're still in the anonymous site. So I'm still up at the top level. Let's say we want to access the private area. So it went to login.eumdemo.com very quickly there, but because of single sign-on, it said you already signed on to the other site. I'm going to take you right into the SharePoint site as that pcarson2 at envisionit365.com user. So that's an example of the single sign-on experience. We've got other examples here. I've got links to all those pages that we were just seeing in the landing application. We actually have a sample application as well that you can go into here just to demonstrate the single sign-on side of things. But I want to switch gears now and let's talk about the Office 365 and Azure AD B2B scenario. So I've got a couple things open here. So here I have an eumdemo.sharepoint.com site. So anytime you see .sharepoint.com, you know immediately that you're in Office 365 because every SharePoint Online site ends in that top level domain. Unfortunately, you can't change that. The only one you have control over is what's the beginning part of your tenant name. I would encourage you, if you're creating a new Office 365 tenant, choose carefully because it's fairly difficult to change this once you've created your tenant. It's possible, but requires a little bit of inside knowledge of whose cage to rattle at Microsoft to make that happen. Okay, so I've got a very similar site to the one that we saw on premises. There's no anonymous version of this because you can't expose a SharePoint Online site anonymously. So everybody needs to be authenticated coming in through here. Okay, so let's actually come back to our other browser here and back to this site. So what I'm going to do now is add a new user. So I can add users one at a time as I showed you previously, or I could bulk import users by filling in an Excel template, uploading it. Maybe there's 100 people that I want to invite en masse. Makes it very easy to do that. I'm going to go back to just the single user though, because that's the scenario that I want to do right now. This time I'm not going to use one of my test accounts. I'm actually going to use my main email address. And the reason I want to do that is because that's the account that I'm currently logged into my Office 365. So the scenario I'm going to take you through is I'm an external user who works for Envision IT, and I'm being invited into this eumdemo.sharepoint.com site. So I want to use the same credentials that I used on my internal Office 365 site. So let's come back here. So I'm going to fill that same username in there. And we can change this form so that that actually wires off of the email field. Depends on your scenario whether you want it that way or not. So we want that SharePoint group. But the difference here is rather than creating an active user, which actually creates an account and you do password management through Extranet User Manager, I'm going to create an Azure B2B account. So here we're not managing the login process. That's managed by Microsoft through Azure AD. So let me go ahead and save those settings. Now this can take a minute to go through. What's going to happen is I'm going to receive a welcome email currently from Microsoft directly. So we're just finishing off a new release of Extranet User Manager where we actually send that invitation email out ourselves. But right now we're still relying on the Microsoft one to go out. The reason we want to take control of that is from a branding and a user experience point of view. So all the emails are configurable through here. So that welcome email that we saw previously, it can be a plain text email, or in this case it's a full rich text HTML email. I've got full control over exactly what the branding and copy in that email is. And we can see we've got placeholders in here for things like display name and username. So those get mail merged with the user's field as the email gets sent out. So you can create a very customized template of exactly what you want that communication to look like. Still waiting for that email to come through here. Sometimes it comes quicker than others. There we go. Okay. So let me pull that across. So this is the out-of-the-box branding that comes from Microsoft. They bring in the logo that we've set in Azure AD, the name of the organization, some of our colors, but otherwise the copy is as provided by Microsoft. I believe you can do some additional customization of this. I don't know how far you can go with that, but our goal is to completely take that over and have it not come from Microsoft, but rather come from your organization. Okay, so I've got the email. I click on the Get Started link here. It takes me back to my Chrome session. Remember, I'm already logged into my Office 365 in this session, which is kind of a typical scenario that, I've already gone into my own corporate portal. Now I want to go into my partner portal. So we can see here we've done some branding on the Azure AD screen. So we've put our background and our copy onto the page here. And we're being invited in to access that eumdemo.sharepoint.com site. So I hit next here. It's going to go through a couple of steps. So it's getting my account ready. So what it's doing is it's actually finishing the provisioning of my Azure AD account. And I'll show you under the hood in a minute what that looks like. And then it'll take me into the site that I've been invited into. And then one of the nice things here, when you invite somebody directly through the portal, they don't get redirected to the site you want to take them to. They actually get redirected to the Azure AD portal, which is a confusing spot to bring end users to. Because we're using the API and automating this process, we can make it a little more granular and take them right into the SharePoint Online site that you want to come into. So now I'm in that same site. So remember, I was in my incognito window here. I logged in as the owner of the site. And now here I'm logged in. If I look at this, the peter_envisionit.com #ext, I mean, that's what Azure AD turns my external user account into in terms of how it represents that. So very similar thing from a permissions point of view. If I come back here, look at my site settings and site permissions, I can see that EUM SharePoint group there has read access into the site. So anybody I put in that group, remember when I added the user, I put them into that EUM SharePoint group, automatically has permission into the site. So I don't need to do anything more with the site to manage that from there. So let's have a look under the hood as to how this is wiring together. So now I'm in the Azure portal for the eumdemo.sharepoint.com site. So if I start at the beginning here, let me just close out of that because I need to refresh it. Come into all users. And we can see right here is that Peter at envisionit.com user. It wasn't there previously. It got added as part of me going through that process of inviting that user in. So I can come under groups here and I see that they're a member of the EUM SharePoint group. In fact, if I come back to my site here, Let's just search that user up. Open that record. And I can say, well, let's put them into a different group. Sorry, I don't remember which of those groups are actually set up in Azure AD. Let's just try a couple different ones. Since I use this demo site for both on-premise and Office 365, sometimes it gets a little confusing. So let's X out of that. Come back into my account and have a look at my groups. Oh, so two of them were there, the test and the WLU demo. Laurier is a client of ours that we're working on right now, have immediately been added in. So we're calling out to what's called the Graph API under the hood and immediately updating Azure AD depending on what's happening with users over on this side here. So you can see it's very easy to add a user, put them in the appropriate group. They get the invitation email, they click the link. If they're already in Office 365, it's a very seamless process in from there. We don't have time today, but it's a slightly different process where you need to create a password if you already don't have an Azure AD account, or you need to create a Microsoft account if you're using a commercial like a Hotmail or a Gmail type of account. I want to take our last couple of minutes and just show you a few more things in here. So we talked about the user side of things. We didn't really talk about groups. So let's do a quick search into groups here and bring up that SharePoint group. So we can see there's 19 people in that group. So in addition to opening a user and defining what groups they belong to, you can do it the other way around and say, okay, I want to open a group and I can remove users out of that group or add additional users in very easily through here. The other thing I want to show you is this add owner side of things where I have the ability to add owners to a group. So let's say I wanted to make that Peter Carson account that I created an owner of this group. What that would mean is when I logged in out of that account into this site here, I would only see the user options in here. I wouldn't see the ability to configure the system. I wouldn't see the ability to manage groups through there. So we can trim down the security to different roles in there and give this to business owners and say, you can now use this to invite in your external users. We also have what's called a group editor role, which allows you to manage the groups themselves. So you wouldn't typically give that to a group owner. It's sort of a super administrator user within your organization that needs the rights to create additional groups, but not configure the system. So those are the different roles that we have in there. We also have a full API behind the scenes. So if you want to build, let's say, a site provisioning process, a lot of our clients do that, where people can request a site. It can actually create the groups, make them an owner of that group, assign the permissions to the site, all as part of that provisioning process, automate that, give the end resulting site back to the client, and away they go from there. So lots of different ways that you can integrate this in. We're in the process of updating the entire product into a new development model. So we're redeveloping the front end into HTML components that then talk to back-end REST APIs. The advantage of that is it's a more modern development technique, but it also makes it easier for us to then embed those components right into things like SharePoint pages. So rather than jumping from a link here in SharePoint over into a completely different application, you can actually embed the search user, the edit user, the my profile, the change password pages right in the SharePoint pages themselves. So that's still probably another month or two out. We've got a couple of major implementations that are using that we're under progress on right now, but that's kind of a future direction of where we're going from that point of view. So let me flip back to the deck. I think we're pretty much finished there, but we'll just confirm that. So we did the 2013. The links are here. So if you pull the deck down, you can actually get the links into the sites that I was showing you there. These are links to all the different client demos that I was showing you. This is just an example of our Azure environment and also a client environment. We don't really have time to dive into the details on that one just now. We'll save that for a future webinar. We did the Office 365 demo already. The links for that are there as well. This is a little more detail on the OCAS scenario that I showed you. So they're actually a hosted client of ours. So we manage their infrastructure in our multi-tenant environment. And then they have their Office 365 tenant as well as their D2L training portal. We provide single sign-on into both of those systems from there. So next steps from here, if you've got questions, you'd like to schedule a one-on-one session with us, we'd love to take a deeper dive in from that point of view with your specific scenario. Reach out to Logan, he can coordinate that and set that up. And also, if you'd like to get going on a hosted trial or an eval copy, again, reach out to Logan. He'll be your point of contact from that point of view. Some upcoming events, there's a few more that we're looking to add. We actually got a pretty busy spring coming up, but confirmed so far, I'm going to be down in Washington, D.C. in April, and in Denver, Colorado, end of May, beginning of June for SharePoint Fest. We're going to be exhibiting there. I'm also going to be giving talks on Extranets at both of those conferences as well. So if you're in the area looking to attend, love to see you. Come on out from there. Some general links here. And I think we're all set. We don't really have time to review back on questions, but if there are ones that were asked that we didn't get a chance to answer, by all means, we'll follow up back with you on that. So on that note, I want to wish you all the well the rest of your day. Appreciate your time and love to have a deeper conversation if you'd like to learn more. Thanks very much. Have a great day.